This was my first Substack Live, and it's quite evident. I have just sent Parsifal invitation, so he should be with you in a few minutes. I apologize for this somewhat rocky start, a bit like CBS. Parsifal, hi, how are you doing?
But yeah, the link seemed to be just to, as part of the audience.
Yeah, I'm sorry. You're the victim of my first experiment with Substack Live, so I haven't figured it out, but I'm glad to have you here. I was just running through some of the biggest stories in China news, and I got to one that I know you have something to say on, which is BYD, the electric car company, now the world's biggest electric car company by sales, suffered its biggest sales drop in 6 years, falling. Global sales fell 41% year on year in February, with domestic sales plunging 2/3 to 89,590 vehicles. And this has, been made worse by the government's reduction of electric vehicle tax exemptions. What do you make of this, Parsifal?
So I come at this from an international perspective, right? Because I was just today reading news about a new plant by Great Wall Motors opening up. Well, planning to invest and open up a very massive factory in Brazil. And this connects to the BYD news because yes, we've seen within China that basically because of this intense competition of Chinese companies competing against other Chinese companies, it's been part of what has actually driven them to international markets, kind of like what happened in the construction sector and so many others, right? Yeah, but even though, year on year, sales drops dramatically, exports year on year incremented around like 50% for BYD. So, obviously in terms of numbers, it's not good for the company, but in terms of international projection, it's still, doing great. But I guess we're going to be seeing a lot more of this. The China market being more constrained is already saturated. And which are the most important markets internationally? Brazil is definitely one of them. We have also Mexico and its connection to the North American market and the negotiations of the North American trade agreement are we're in the midst of it. I'm sure the car, especially electric car manufacturing center, is going to be a huge part of the conversation. Yes, the headline might catch your attention in terms of huge drops, but I think internationally is going to push, in my view, even more, or it's going to exert more pressure on these Chinese companies to seek in international markets like those.
A sign of weakness in the Chinese EV sector so much as a sign that the overcapacity is going to continue to be exported.
Yes, well, definitely internally, you have two angles, right? If you see it from the domestic sector, meaning the China sector, it's just intense competition. We've gotten to this point where at least in the main urban cities, it's completely saturated. So, margins shrink. You see the government removing some of the subsidies for the industry. So it's quite different if you look at this from the domestic perspective, than if you look at the international market of electric and hybrid cars.
Okay, let's move on to like the meat of today's discussion, which is really to talk to you about how Latin American people, countries, leaders are responding to the global shitfest that is going on.
Right way to put it.
Perhaps I put up a slide of your biography before we started, but to briefly introduce Parsifal, he's founder and executive director of the Andres Bello Foundation, China Latin America Research Center. He's a foreign policy analyst specializing in Sino-Latin American relations with a focus on his native Venezuela. He has quite an education, a degree in telecommunications engineering, a master's in East Asian Studies from Columbia University, and a master's in international politics from the School of Oriental and African Studies, or SOAS. And he spent time also working and living in China. So this is quite a a perspective that is often missing, I think, from the discussions about China in English language, and that is the huge question of Latin America. And it's become particularly important in a way to understand the global situation because, of course, with Trump actions in Venezuela and in the Caribbean completely changing everybody's calculus on what is going on. So, you know, maybe I can just start by asking about Venezuelan civil society and opposition figures inside the country. I mean, how have they actually reacted to Maduro's capture? And, is there any sense that there might be some liberation in this, or is this just some new form of dependency under the threat of force?
Okay, so the first thing I would say is that we're still in the midst of this. It's been 2 months. Trust me, a lot has happened. It's obviously internationally, the removal of Maduro, it's what, caught the headlines and some of Trump's comments on the oil industry. But it's like week on week, we've seen a lot of developments on the ground. Get into them as the conversation develops. But point being, there's still, I think, this is just the beginning. We're going to see how things develop over the next couple of months, maybe years. But when it comes to the situation on the ground, a lot of people might be surprised to understand or to hear that there's quite a positive sentiment across the board within people from the still Chavista regime, still you removed Maduro, but the people who have ruled Venezuela for the last 25 years are still pretty much in power. It's the same institutions, it's the same government representatives. So you just removed two people from an important, large bureaucracy. So when I say that we've seen even positive signals from the people who are still in government, who are supposed or at least sold themselves as ideologues, uh, have played pretty much a pragmatic role given the situation of the massive military operation and military deployment to the Caribbean in the build-up to January 3rd. Within the opposition camp, again, we have to understand this on historical perspective, at least for the last, 5, 10 years. Just 2 years ago, against all odds, the opposition's main figure, Maria Corina Machado, led what was a very unfavorable election in Venezuela and still managed to win overwhelmingly. This is backed by all the government tallies that were collected. This was a huge logistical movement that couldn't have been possible without an overwhelming support from the Venezuelan population who went out to vote massively in an environment of extreme repression. So we shouldn't see this as an unilateral military operation from the United States. What Trump did on January 3rd wouldn't have been possible without the run up of the previous 2 years of the stolen election. You can go back a little bit more to 2019 during Trump's first term and the interim government of Venezuela. And so this has been building up to what just exploded on.
Make sure I'm understanding you right. You're saying that both the government, the Maduro, the remnant regime remains in place, and they are somewhat positive because they're still
Obviously, not all of them.
the opposition as well.
Yeah, no. You understood correctly. Obviously, not all of them. They're obvious. They're important figures that have been vehemently, openly opposed to what happened on January 3rd. But you see it from not only from pronouncements, but just to give you one example that I think it's pretty clearly very very eye opening. The Venezuela's legislature, which was co-opted over 10 years ago by the ruling elite around Maduro, took months to approve any sort of new laws unless they were explicitly driven from the top down. In the matter of the last 2 months, they managed to do two huge things. One, a complete overhaul of the oil legislation in Venezuela. Venezuela being, a petrostate with the largest reserves on earth. And then just yesterday, they approved in a matter of like 24 to 48 hours, a complete revamp of Venezuela's mining laws, which is another after oil is the other main income of the country. That wouldn't have, even with having tutelage, which is basically what we have today, they're completely subordinate to Washington, which is what makes it even more surprising that you didn't see any public outrage coming from specific figures. It has been, they have fallen very much in line, which, can be read from different angles. But from my view is that the way that the country was going, a lot of people in power weren't happy with this. And this is something that has been said by the Trump administration, but it has also been a conversation within Venezuela that Maduro was given all the possible off ramps, and not only himself, but the overall ruling elite, and they never took it. So I'm not aware of internal conversations, but just the way things played out gives everyone this sense. And if you look at political commentary within the country, what you're seeing for the first time open spectrum TV channels have been basically silent on any political commentary for 10 to 15 years, suddenly starting to criticize the government. You've seen a huge amount of political prisoners, over 400 have been freed so far. So this to me says two things. One, even within the elite, there probably was some underlying, call it resentment or call it, opposition to the country's leadership, and that it was completely unsustainable. From the government's perspective, I think I would have never dreamed, even for someone who follows this closely, that we would be at this point just 2 months afterwards. So it's, yes, there's immense pressure from the United States, but even that amount of pressure, if you look at, comparable scenarios with their differences, obviously, Panama around 35 years ago, what happened in Dominican Republic, other U.S. military interventions in the region, this has, I think that not even Trump and Marco Rubio, who is probably one of the masterminds behind the entire operation, never dreamed that this would go as fluid as it's actually gone.
Which has perhaps led them into Iran. Before we talk about that, I mean,
Yeah. Uh,
China, and so when Carrie in the questions asked about the effect of the national security strategy in November 2025, and I think it's the national security strategy, but also what followed the murders of the whoever they were on boats in the Caribbean, and obviously the capture of Maduro. I mean, how does this change the calculus on China in Caracas and in other Latin American capitals?
So I've written about this, and my sense, after the publication of the national security strategy, after the military buildup, 6 months building a huge military capabilities in the Caribbean, plus what happened on January 3rd. This is I think most countries in the region are reading this as a new normal. This is not a Trump episode. This will go on after Trump is gone. This refocus of American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere is here to stay. So that is a new calculus that governments in the region have to make, because there's just no comparison of the amount of pressure, economic, political, security, military, that the U.S. can exert on the countries of Latin America. There's just no comparison. China would only dream of the level of leverage that the United States has in the Western Hemisphere for a lot of reasons, historical ones, but also cultural, political ties. It runs much deeper than people actually realize, and it's not just the U.S. doing whatever the hell it wants in the region, because there's familial ties, there's deep rooted security ties between the different military establishments across the region and the United States. And given this, I'm careful with when I say this, because I'm tempted to say that there's a window, given everything that's happened, that for the first time, I don't know if ever, but in a long time, that in the security space, Latin American countries, particularly Mexico, Central America, Andean countries, and the Caribbean, are aligned when it comes to security. What do I mean by this? So, which are the main issues for the Trump administration, but also for the Biden administration when it comes, migration and drug trafficking, irregular armed groups? These are exactly the same issues that Mexico is dealing with, that countries like Honduras, like Guatemala, like Colombia, like Venezuela, like Peru, like Bolivia, that are they are dealing with. I believe there's a window for Latin American countries to insert their own interests in the US's security agenda. But again, it's this has to be taken uh, with a whisk of salt, because the U.S. Latin America there's no shortage of anti-U.S. sentiment in the region, which is why I think this specific time in history is interesting, because you would have thought that the region would have come out guns blazing. I mean that figuratively, not
Literally, yeah.
criticizing what the US did. There's no comparison. You cannot compare what happened in Panama in the 80s and what happened in this is the first time there's is the first large incursion in South America. The countries in Central America and the Caribbean are much smaller in territory in terms of their own bureaucracy, their security apparatus. This was no small feat. It's the first time that this happens in South America. And despite the ideological underpinnings of a lot of the governments, plus this view to see U.S. Security agenda with a lot of skepticism, out of the 34 countries that we have in Latin America, you have 9 countries came out praising what the US did. 9 countries came out criticizing the US incursion in Venezuela, out of which there were only like really vehement opposition from the usual suspects, Cuba and Nicaragua. And the rest of the countries didn't even comment. They say, look, these are internal issues in Venezuela. We're just not going to get involved. That is a very different region from the last 15, 20 years. It didn't come out with a loud voice to criticize this, and I think that connects to what I was mentioning beforehand, that this has only, I would say, quote unquote, worked so far because Maduro and Venezuela became representations of all these issues that align a security agenda between the United States and many countries, as I mentioned, Central America and the Andean region primarily, because of irregular groups, because of financing, because of migration. Migration has been a huge destabilizer.
Possible.
Venezuelan migration.
So to interrupt, but it sounds to me like what you're saying is that the new reality is that China actually is going to play second fiddle to the United States in Latin America, and that Latin American countries are going to, for various reasons, line up somewhat alongside Trumpism.
To some extent, yes, but it's going to, because all these issues, all these areas, China or Chinese actors in general really do not have an important presence when it comes to overall security. Even for all the headlines about China setting up these special missions of satellites or space observation sites in different parts of the region, it's just peanuts compared to the US's security presence and military cooperation in the region. On that front, I don't see any interest on the Chinese side of actually getting involved. They have enough problems with the United States to start picking another fight, even if it's triangulated through other countries. But these are not areas where we've seen China doubling down. So you might see alignment on the security front. But when it comes to economics, when it comes to energy transition, when it comes to renewables, we actually we at the foundation we did a important research last year on China's role in South America's energy transition. And one of the key takeaways was that it's a juggernaut that is coming, and we're just starting to see the presence of Chinese companies. I'm not talking about just only solar panels. I'm talking about electrical infrastructure. I'm talking about smart cities. I'm talking about fintech. I'm talking about telecommunications. So obviously, there are some areas where they overlap with U.S. security interests. In those areas, we're probably going to see a lot of tension. But I would say, at least on the outside of these dual use sectors, we're not we're gonna I think we're gonna be seeing China doubling down, doing a lot of work, doing a lot of investment without the US pushing back in any way, and vice versa. I don't see Chinese counterparts trying to get involved, especially given everything that we've seen over the last 6 months, because odds are the US will exert pressure like it's already doing in a lot of countries in the region, in the telecommunications sector, for example.
Right. So Carrie's commented, so trade with China is real. The hegemonic bluster in the national security statement is just that talk. I guess that's one reading of what you're saying, that China will stay away from or be deterred from getting involved in issues that focus Uncle Sam on security issues, but otherwise will get on with what it's doing.
Yeah, I see this, and I always, I've used the case of Argentina, that it's a perfect example. Just tomorrow, we're going to see what's it called? It's the meeting that Trump is holding in Mar-a-Lago with Latin American heads of state. The name is, well, it's very Trumpy. Don't remember the name. Point being, this is an ideological group. You looked it up?
Yeah.
Uh,
Well,
no, it's more or less the same thing like like this peace summit, right? These are ideological blocks that will live as long as the great leader is in power. I see this also through the Venezuelan lens. I see this like ALBA. It was the Bolivarian Alliance of the Americas, which was this organization of countries led by Venezuela and Cuba, which completely disappeared into just forgetfulness after Chavez died. I see this more or less the same type of organizations, right? They don't have an underpinning bureaucracy that goes beyond one simple, the president in power. In 2 years, no one is going to be thinking about this summit that's going to take place tomorrow about, you know, the U.S. leading this effort to push China out of the region. So going back to Argentina, because Milei is going to be there. So ideologically, at least in terms of worldview, not on economic terms, Milei is, Trump's best buddy. The U.S. basically bailed out Argentina with a 20 billion dollar bailout that helped Milei basically pass a lot of reforms that his economic agenda. So directing economic interventionism, very much like China has done in a bunch of other places. So ideological alignment, very close politically speaking, and yet what has happened to China-Argentina relations in the last 2 years during the Milei administration? They've been better than ever, precisely because Argentina had been closed off in a lot of ways because of terrible economic policies from the previous administration. And Milei has been opening up the country, and this includes Chinese companies. Just yesterday, there was this announcement that there's going to be this like $200 million to the, I don't remember the exact number, but it's between $200 and $300 million investment in the Salta province to develop new sites of lithium exploitation by a group of Chinese companies. They are building important infrastructure in terms of gas from one of Argentina's key deposits of natural gas. They are building electrical infrastructure. So even though that you don't have the, let's say, the central government's backing for engagement with China that we saw with previous governments in Argentina, they're not sponsoring this. But they're not standing against it either. So they're just letting economic relations with China follow their due course without actually promoting them openly. Political ideological alignment with the United States, but at the same time, you're dealing economically with China.
Well, let's talk about one last subject. Given what's going on in Iran, by now I think people have to realize that, like a lot of authoritarians, when Trump says things, he often means them. Uh, there is an ongoing blockade on Cuba because they're not allowing Venezuela to send any oil or gas to Cuba. What is the talk in Latin American political circles about the future of Cuba, the United States' intentions? Because one imagines Marco Rubio must be salivating about regime change in Cuba. And does China have any kind of role to play in this? Is China going to do anything to come to Cuba's aid given this blockade? Or
Well, frankly, I don't think so, especially in a country, because this connects directly with Venezuela and with Marco Rubio's role in the Trump administration. So it's no secret. It's his has been the center of his political career, his antagonism towards the Cuban regime and also to the Venezuelan, and they're clearly connected. But I'd be careful to extrapolate this to other regions. And you mentioned initially that they might have been a little bit too optimistic from the Venezuelan case, and that might have gone into the thinking towards the Iran attacks. Hopefully, that was not part of it. I think what I described before, that I think even close political allies of Maduro are happy he's gone. I have no proof, but I have no doubts that Pedro, especially Lula, are happy that this guy is gone because, again, they represented a lot of problems for the region. And this connects directly to Cuba as well. You might see a lot of rhetoric from specifically from left-leaning governments or left-leaning political figures, but no one is going to complain if there's eventual regime change in Cuba. If this actually happens connected with US domestic politics, if you manage a regime transition in Venezuela in the next couple of years, because that's still a big if. We still have, as I mentioned, the same people in government. We don't see any signs of Trump being interested in a democratic transition in Venezuela. That could definitely backfire down the road if we just in a Chavismo 2.0, and you are this would be a throwback to the 60s and 70s of the US being happy with dictatorships as long as they aligned and were under tutelage from Washington, right? Because you will, again, this is a specific window. That's why I say we're still in the midst of it, right? But if Venezuela eventually makes a transition in the next couple of years and we do have elections and you manage some sort of regime change in Cuba, well, Marco Rubio he will win the next US elections and he would become this huge influential figure in Latin America because, at least if you look through political commentary, usually most people ascribe everything that is happening in Latin America to Marco Rubio, not to Donald Trump, precisely because of his history of being quite frontal with the regimes in Venezuela and in Cuba. So, do you still hear me?
can you hear you? Camera seemed to have disappeared. I can still hear you.
Okay, well, I'll try to get it on, but I'll just finish my comments. Look, we'll see what happens this year and what happens with Cuba. And to China, I frankly don't see they just announced this a couple of days ago. They installed like 5,000 solar panels to help alleviate the energy shortages in the island on the island. So this is as far as China's going to go.
Right.
And they're dealing right now with Delcy in Caracas for sure, and they will probably deal with whoever comes out on top in Cuba.
Yeah. All right, Parsifal. Well, we've lost your beautiful face, but thank you so much for a rather enlightening conversation. And it sounds to me like there's a very different way of looking at all of these questions in Latin America than there is in the Anglosphere. And perhaps somewhat, maybe it's misguided, but somewhat more optimistic. I'll take a dose, a little piece of sunniness if I can get it.
Yes, we'll see.
We will see.
We will definitely see, but at least for now, there is skeptical optimism.
Right.
And just to close out on the Venezuela front, I know and especially for me, this is very hard to swallow. No one wants to see their country, invaded by a foreign country, regardless of the country, and be under, political and military tutelage. That being said, we are far better off today than we were 2 months ago. Just the fact that this amount of political prisoners are out with their families, with their friends, that's a win. You have to take that. Even for all, the actions around Venezuela's oil industry and Venezuela's oil assets from a local perspective. Venezuelans, if you look, I'm going to Caracas next week, and the people I've been talking to, they all say, look, at the end of the day, no one was seeing the money from the oil industry. It was going to China. It was going to the Russians. Now it's going to be going to the United States. So it's more of the same, but at least, political prisoners are free.
Right.
Again, it really depends on how you approach this. And
Yeah.
the fact that you see a little bit more openness on the media front, that you're seeing political opposition voices ever more loud, a lot of people that came out after being in prison for years. The first thing that they did when they came out of prison was go on social media to criticize the government. So this is all ongoing, and we'll see how it develops over time.
Well, Parsifal, thank you. That was unexpectedly refreshing. I really appreciate you taking the time, and perhaps we can talk again after you get back from Venezuela.
Yeah, sure. I haven't been back in a couple of years, so it's gonna be interesting.
Thanks to everyone for joining us. Thank you very much, Carrie, for all the comments. Sorry I couldn't respond to all of them. Thanks, Parsifal. Have a great trip.
Yeah,
And
thank you,
I'm
Jeremy. Always a pleasure.
okay. See you all soon. Thank you for joining. How do I shut this down? I guess I hit end.